I see us as a profession really evolving into a profession where there's lots of GPs of eye care who I hope would pick up some of the children who would need to then see an optometrist that specialised in vision and learning.
Welcome to the OT podcast, which takes a deep dive into the topics affecting optometry today. Each time we'll find a real expert in their field and attempt to pull everything we can out of their brain so it may reside in yours. This is the 14th episode in the series, and we are recording on the 18th of November 2024. You can listen to the other episodes on the OT website, on Apple or Spotify, or from your usual podcast provider. In our 14th episode, we'll be speaking to Professor Bruce Evans.
So Kerry, new year, new CPD cycle. So perhaps a good opportunity to talk about what CPD we've got available at the very beginning of the new cycle. In terms of articles, we'll be looking to cover topics such as dispelling refractive surgery myths, importance of UV protection, how lifestyle influences myopia progression and development, and also a nice article on biomarkers and the eye. We also want to take the opportunity to flag that we've got 100% optical coming up fairly soon. The programme was launched late last year. Bookings are now open for 100% optical. So Kerry, what have we got coming up in terms of CPD video?
This month, we're on the top 4 paediatric neuro-optometric presentations. So this is Lorcan Butler from the Brain Tumour Charity, and he's going to tell us all about things like idiopathic intracranial hypertension in children, pseudopapilledema. We're going to learn about optic dystrophy, optic neuritis, Horner syndrome, the pupil problems that you need to pick up in practice. So it's one of those really must-watch videos that will freak everybody out, but also inform their practice.
Thanks, Kerry.
Don't forget to visit the OT website, a source for all your optics-related news, in-depth features and opinion. It's updated 7 days a week. Our education library is bursting with over 600 past CPD exams, as well as video skills guides and webinars which will support your learning on a range of clinical topics and techniques. Why not watch our recently released new 3-part video skills guide exploring the management of dry eye. Visit www.optometry.co.uk.
So it's a pleasure to introduce our guest today, Professor Bruce Evans, who is visiting professor to City, University of London, and to London South Bank University. From 1998 to 2023, he was Director of Research at the Institute of Optometry. His main areas of research are myopia management, binocular vision, children's vision, dyslexia, contact lenses, computer vision syndrome, and headaches, including migraine. Bruce has authored over 270 scientific and professional papers, 9 editions of optometric textbooks, and has given more than 250 invited lectures. So Bruce, welcome to the OT podcast, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, it's a pleasure to be here.
And we've got a lot to talk about, really, and I think it makes sense if we can, if it's okay with you, just go right back to the beginning and how you started out in optometry. And was that always a career choice for you, or were there other things that were the sort of options at the time?
Yeah, I think like many other would-be optometrists, I was initially thinking of medicine and had some difficult interviews at medical schools. And in really looking around medical schools, I realised that I wasn't that committed to medicine. And I loved biology. It was my favourite subject at school. And the favourite part of that was eyes. So I had a careers evening at the school and met a dentist, thought that's not for me. He was a very nice chap, but not for me. And met an optometrist and I really liked him. He was engaging. And I thought, yeah, I think I'd like to do that. So I went for quite a late interview. And amazingly, I was interviewed by David Edgar, who I now work with a great deal. And he was a very young lecturer at the time. And he's such a nice person. He's so engaging and he just inspired me. I thought, yeah, I'd like to be like him. That looks like a great thing to do. So I applied for optometry and yeah, I got a great pre-reg job. I worked with Andy Franklin, who's brilliant original thinker and was a terrific pre-reg supervisor. And I realised then that this was a great career and started thinking about how to develop it and where to go from there.
And then when you finished your pre-reg, did you remain in clinical practice or did you go straight into starting your PhD? And was it David Edgar that influenced that path you took?
At that time, I thought I was going to be in practice, I think, forever. I wanted to have my own practice. I come from a small business background, and I really liked the idea of being my own boss. But at that time, Andy Franklin and I were working for a guy called Mike Revel, who had a group of, I think, 5 practices then. And he put me in charge of a fairly new practice in a new town in Essex. And I went straight there when I qualified, and that was great fun. Being a new town, the population, the demographic was really young. There were lots of young adults who were really interested in contact lenses, and that was the time in the 1980s when soft lenses were just developing. There were lots of new developments all the time. Materials were improving, practice was developing, and I was really keen on contact lenses. So we built quite a good contact lens practice there, but also because there were lots of young families, there were many children. And I'd always enjoyed working with children. And of course, Andy Franklin was a great pediatric optometrist. So I started seeing lots of children getting interested in binocular vision and orthoptics. And also, really by chance, I read an article in the precursor of OT on dyslexia and vision. And it was a good article and I really enjoyed it. And the next day I just happened to see a child in practice who was dyslexic and got in discussion with the mother about what I'd been reading in this article. And she got the impression that I really hadn't tried to give her that I was some sort of expert in dyslexia and vision. And she was involved in the local dyslexia association and started sending all of their children to me. So of course I then thought I'd better get some expertise. So I started reading a lot more about the subject and becoming really interested in it. And realizing really that there were more questions than there were answers. And so I started thinking about doing research into it. And about that time, Neville Drasdow at Aston University had got a college scholarship to have a PhD student look at dyslexia and vision. And Neville was a polymath, and it was one of the many subjects he had researched over the years. And so he advertised, I applied, and decided to leave practice and go off to do a PhD for 3 years. That was great fun. I mean, Neville, again, was another original thinker, researched lots of aspects of optometry. We'd have incredibly far-ranging conversations, very rarely touching on the topic that I'd gone to discuss with him, but really interesting and really fired my enthusiasm for doing research. And that really was how I got into research and how I got into researching dyslexia and vision in particular. By the way, what we found in that study was that although there are some visual factors that are related to dyslexia, they're only a peripheral factor in dyslexia. And that's still very much my view, that most dyslexics don't have any visual problems at all. The role of the optometrist is occasionally addressing one of many factors that can be relevant to dyslexia.
Do you think that message is out there in mainstream optometry? I know from my time in practice, I had lots of parents coming to me with children with a diagnosis of dyslexia and felt like the optometrist could be the solution to all of those problems. Parents sometimes expected me to be able to cure dyslexia through things like coloured filters and so on.
Yeah, and I think it's understandable that parents sometimes think that because they have a child who, when they talk to them, they may be as intelligent as any other child, and when the child looks at words in a book, they struggle. And so it's understandable that parents think, this must be a visual problem. I think our first role really is to educate the parents about the fact that dyslexia is multifactorial and that we're only going to be looking at one possible factor. But yeah, I still find the same as you, that there are a lot of parents that have expectations that we can do a lot more than we can do. But having said that, every optometrist who specialises in dyslexia and vision will report some cases they've seen where vision was a major part of the story of that child's problems. So occasionally we can make quite a significant difference. But I think it's often our key role really is to put the parents in touch with a range of other healthcare professionals and educational professionals who can really help them address the range of difficulties that child may have.
Is this an area that you think actually shouldn't be a specialism and all optometrists should be more clued up on it? Because you've got some people doing visual stress assessments, but it's few and far between. Can they help? Can coloured filters help and overlays? How much difference do they make to children?
Yeah, it's still controversial, but my experience is that coloured filters can help. And the best data we have is that about 1 in 5 dyslexic children benefit from coloured filters. Now, there's a need for more research, and that 1 in 5 is based on a couple of studies that were underpowered, so that didn't have enough participants to get a certain answer. But that's what we think. And we think really that there's a range of conditions where people have a visual system that can get overloaded. They have a hyper excitability of the visual cortex. And this can affect some people with dyslexia, quite a few people with autism, and some people with migraine, particularly migraine with aura. And these seem to be some of the conditions that can be helped by individually prescribed coloured filters. As to the role of every optometrist, I see us as a profession really evolving into a profession where there's lots of GPs of eye care, if you like, general practitioners in terms of optometry, who I hope would pick up some of the children who would need to then see an optometrist that specialised in vision and learning. For example, if children say that when they read, words appear to blur or move or wobble on the page, and the optometrist doesn't find a conventional reason like that, for that, like a refractive error or a BV problem, then I would hope that they would refer to an optometrist who specialised in this field, who would then do more testing, more tests of binocular vision and accommodation, but also testing to see whether there's a likelihood that that child would benefit from coloured filters.
Do you think with the topic of binocular vision, I don't know whether Kerry would agree with me, but it's a difficult topic. And when you talk of subspecialty, I think optometrists are attracted by the sparkle of fancy kit, OCTs and all this kind of funky instrumentation. And binocular vision doesn't really lend itself well to making itself attractive, I would say, because it's a difficult topic and there's not so much funky kit that's emerging. So how do we engage practitioners in binocular vision?
It is difficult, and the College of Optometrists years ago, for many years, had a diploma in orthoptics that, to be fair, not many did, but those that did do it found it very enjoyable and a fascinating topic. And it's a shame that that's no longer available, because I think there is a need for optometrists to specialise sometimes in binocular vision and orthoptics. There is an Orthoptic and Binocular Vision Association, which is an organisation that optometrists can join. I think it's free to join, and they organise a course at least once a year on orthoptics. And there are a number of optometrists that are interested in this topic, but it is difficult, you're right. There's no kit. It's not something where you can say, well, there is this particular bit of equipment that we use that we would charge this fee for. So you need a proper fee-based structure to make it financially viable. And of course, you need to work closely with hospital orthoptists as well, because they will provide some tests that we can't provide in practice. But there'll be some cases, I think, that are better managed in the community by an optometrist. And there'll be other cases that are better managed in the hospital eye service. And a key part of the role of the optometrist is helping to signpost cases to where they're going to receive the best management.
Does that ever happen? Do you ever get two-way referral, i.e. the hospital orthoptists are referring people to you and vice versa?
Yeah, I have had that. Yep. And not often enough, but sometimes hospital orthoptists will, when they finish dealing with amblyopia, for example, and the HCS hospital orthoptists are brilliant at detecting and treating amblyopia, but when they finish treating amblyopia, that child will still need to be monitored. And what often happens is they just say informally to the parents, you need to go and see your community optometrist and have follow-up. In an ideal world, they'd send a report. And they'd give a letter to the parents, say, take this to your community optometrist. And the orthoptist would say, this is the acuity that we've got, that we've achieved through patching. So the optometrist then knows when the acuities drop back and when they need to send the child back. And I don't think that happens enough. I think the communication between the HES and the community is often one way. And we need to work harder to encourage our hospital colleagues to send reports to us as often as we send reports to them.
Well, I totally agree. That's often how we learn as well, especially when you're newly qualified in practice. You learn and improve the quality of your referrals by hearing back from the hospital and getting the official word. back. Otherwise, you'd wait till the patient turns up 2 years later for the next eye examination, and they can't really remember what happened, and the details are sketchy.
And it's interesting, it's a topic that with colleagues feel passionate about, and we did some research at the Institute of Optometry into this a few years ago, and what we found was that the areas where there's good feedback from the hospital to the optometrists, the areas where the hospital reply to the optometric referrals, are the areas where they get better quality referrals. So whenever you speak to somebody working in a hospital, be they an optometrist, ophthalmologist or orthoptist, and they say, well, we really wish that the quality of referrals coming from the community was better, which is a fair criticism often, the first reply should be, okay, how good are your replies? Do you reply to every referral that you get to the optometrist? Because if they don't, then I'm afraid that they're part of the problem and they need to work at making themselves part of the solution.
And Bruce, you referenced Institute of Optometry. Are you able to share a bit more about the story of your involvement with the Institute? I think it was formerly London Refraction Hospital back in the day. I don't know whether that predated your arrival or not.
When I was an undergraduate, in those days, undergraduates at City University of London did some evening clinics at the London Refraction Hospital, which later became the Institute of Optometry. And when I first qualified, I would go back to the Institute and teach some contact lens clinics in the evening and work with Ron Roberts, which was a great fun to work with him. And I had a real affection for the Institute. It was a charity. I felt, doing really good things. And while I was at Aston, Keith Edwards was running the Institute and Judith Morris was about to take over. And they came to talk to me. And at that time, Janet Stone had retired from the Institute and Ron Mallet was about to retire. And they thought, well, we need someone who's interested in children's vision and BV. So they basically offered me a job to run some clinics at the Institute in children's vision, dyslexia and vision, BV and paediatrics, and also to build the research capacity at the Institute, because they'd always done some research, but there was really a need to get it onto a stronger footing in terms of research. So when I finished my PhD, I was working, I think then 4 days a week at the Institute and 2 days a week in practice. And after a number of years, that swapped over because I'd been working then at a practice in Brentwood in Essex that was founded by Philip Cole, who was a founding president of the college. He was a great man, established a brilliant practice, and two of his ex-pre-regs, Tony Martin and Tony Tregaskis, took over the practice from him. They were getting to the age where they were thinking about retirement, so I joined them. But at that time, I had to reduce my time at the Institute of Optometry, and I then swapped round. So I was 1 or 2 days a week at the Institute and 4 days a week in practice. And that carried on really for a number of years, trying to both be a clinician and be a researcher. And my time at the Institute, I stopped doing clinics when I reduced my days there and purely did research at the Institute. And very often it would be a question that I had in practice. So I'd seen a patient, I'd wondered what was the best thing to do for them, read the literature and thought, well, the answer's not out there. And that would lead to another research study, and we'd apply for funding and sometimes get a PhD student in and do that research study at the Institute of Optometry. And that really became a core in my life as director of research there, that changed completely in 2008 when, thanks to Rishi Agarwal and Deacon Hall, the Institute decided to set up a professional doctorate in optometry. That was one of the first in the UK. The other one was at Aston University. A professional doctorate is equivalent to a PhD, but it's designed for practitioners. So it's designed to take a practitioner who wants to do research and to teach them the research skills they need and let them research the topic that they have a burning passion to research. So from 2008 onwards, we had a number of these doctorate students who would come in with a research question. And my job then was to put together a supervisory team, because I'm not an expert in everything by any means. So I would put together a supervisory team of people who had the relevant expertise, and we would put together a program of research. Often, again, my contribution would be to try and make the idea workable, because people often are over-ambitious about what a doctorate research program can achieve. And we kind of made it sensible. And over the years, we researched a very broad number of topics ranging from accommodation to autism, contact lenses to glaucoma, keratoconus to myopia control, OCTs, optometric referrals, UV exposure in pilots, and vision in pregnancy and vision in the menstrual cycle. So quite diverse, really, really interesting, and that involve working with some great co-supervisors, most commonly David Edgar and Peter Allen. So that was a nice circularity to my career, that having been really enthused to do optometry by David Edgar, I've ended up collaborating with Dave hugely over the years, which is always a great pleasure.
And Ian, you were one of the people that did that professional doctorate, aren't you?
Yeah, I did the professional doctorate via Aston, and as Bruce has said, it's a significant undertaking, but I think it's a really nice way for practitioners that are used to doing clinical work to just develop new skills in research, really.
I think it's so valuable. I don't know what you feel, Ian, but I've noticed in so many optometrists over the years that the way they think changes as they do the doctorate. As you get used to reading research, critically appraising research, including our own research, it changes the way that you think about clinical questions. I don't know if you found that yourself.
I think not just clinical questions, but any question in life, outside of optometry. I think people might say something in conversation about X, Y, Z. Running is a good example. I like running a lot, and a lot of my running friends will say, "Oh, you should be doing this if you keep injuring your hip." And you think, okay, well, where's the evidence for that? Can you point me towards the sources that justify that statement? So I think it changes your perspective on lots of different things. But I think what I found, having done a PhD as well, which is a slightly different flavour, I suppose, seeing those differences between the really clinically orientated research that you can do as a professional doctorate versus more of a lab-based study as a PhD. I think it's really nice to have those two different routes to go down.
And it would be great to get more of the profession doing research, I think, as well. I mean, certainly in medicine, I don't know of an ophthalmologist that's not been involved in a significant research study at some point in their career. And I think that would be really good if we could move towards that with optometrists, because the evidence base underlying optometry in so many areas needs a lot more work to solidify it. And I think we all have a responsibility to contribute to that whenever we can.
I think chatting to Mark Dunn, who was at Aston University and involved in supervising some students, he said, as optometrists, we collect so much data on a day-to-day basis, yet what do we do with it? It just sits there on computer systems. And we don't really leverage the outcomes from all of these consultations that thousands of optometrists are doing daily. And there's just so much more that we could do with that information.
Yeah, and going off on a slight tangent, but I got very interested recently. I did a talk on the limitations of randomized controlled trials. Now, that sounds strange because everyone agrees that the randomized controlled trial is an incredibly thorough way of doing research that is absolutely essential to prove that interventions work. And that's true. And I've been involved in about a dozen randomized controlled trials over the years. We've just this week published the latest one. And it is important, but there's a lot of research now showing that it's also insufficient to do a randomized controlled trial. And that's really interesting because the thing about a randomized controlled trial is you do things differently to the way they're done in practice. The limitation of a randomized controlled trial is, by definition, you do things differently to the way they're done in practice. So you give people the gold standard treatment. Some people get a control treatment. You'll do more testing on them before you treat them. You'll follow them up for longer. You'll give them a much more detailed explanation of what's going on. All of that means that the findings of a randomized controlled trial may not inform what actually happens in the real clinic. So as well as doing randomized controlled trials, it's still essential, but you need additionally to do observational studies where you actually see how something works in real world practice. And you need both of those approaches. Now, the relevance of this for every community optometrist listening is it means that this divorce between somebody doing a randomized controlled trial, which is difficult to do, and you need people with research expertise, in addition to those people, you need real clinicians to be doing clinical research to show that the things that might be proven to work in a randomized controlled trial also work in practice. And this means all of us, It breaks down the barrier between a researcher and a clinician. And it might be IP optometrists that want to use chloramphenicol in community optometric practice. Is there an evidence base using it in that setting? If there isn't, then they need to gather that evidence. Myopia control interventions, often they're researched in hospital clinics in China. Do they work in a community optometric practice in the UK? So there's a great need for real engagement in research by normal practitioners. And yeah, they'll probably need an academic to collaborate with to make sure that the research methodology is sound. But I agree with you completely, Ian, that I think we need to get a real engagement with research in using everyday clinical data that optometrists gather to further the evidence base.
How do you see us doing that? I mean, you've suddenly got all our listeners interested, going, hey, yeah, I'd like to do that. And now what do they do?
Well, you are going to need to standardise what you do to a slight extent. So you're going to need to have measurements that you can use for research. But I would say start talking to academics. And if you're interested in myopia control and maybe you've got early access to a new myopia control intervention, then start talking to myopia control researchers about how you can assess how well that works in a typical practice. I think also we need to think about the computerized clinical records that we all have now. Well, most of us have electronic clinical records, and those are a huge resource. And often the companies that make those systems actually would be quite keen to collaborate and show that their system can be used to provide data that's helpful for the community. So I think it's a matter of talking to academics, getting some relationships set up, and then building research program, basically.
And Bruce, just latching onto your tangent about limitations of RCTs, I'm in the process of doing another course in sleep medicine, and I need to do a systematic review. The parameters that they've set for me are that we strongly recommend that you only include RCTs. And I just feel like it's a real missed opportunity. I want to look at ocular manifestations of sleep disorders. And just by definition, a lot of those things are observational studies, and it's a cool topic to look at. I'm constrained by the model that the university want to impose upon me by only looking at RCTs.
Yeah, and I think it is a form of prejudice, to be honest. And I've had this with some journals where some journals are stuck in the rut of saying, and some conference organisers as well, if it's not an RCT, it's not valid, it's not proper research. And there's lots of evidence out there from really leading biomedical scientists showing that's not the case. But unfortunately, some journals and some researchers are slow to catch on to that. I mean, I did a review recently on this low-level red light laser as an intervention for myopia control. And actually, if you just looked at the randomized controlled trials, they show that it works. It does slow myopia. But if you do a broader review, and that's exactly what we did, and I insisted actually that we did more than a systematic review. We did a broader review that would include case studies as well, that would include lab-based research. And when you do that, you include research like Austrian and Schill, who measure the light levels from these devices and raise really important safety concerns about these. And there's a case study out there as well that raises really important safety concerns. And it's only through doing that broader type of research that you actually identify those issues. So our conclusion was much more conservative than it would have been if we hadn't done a broader review in that case.
Yeah, I've looked very recently at that, Bruce, and you're perhaps aware there's a meta-analysis that was published quite recently on red light that included those 5 or 6 RCTs, but of course it doesn't mention the case report that potentially flags some concerns about risks of retinal damage in children.
Yeah, and I guess the broader conclusion is that all research and a randomized controlled trial and a systematic review, they're all types of research. They all have limitations. They're all limited by the question they ask and the way they address that question. And we just need to look at all research within the context of its design. And we need a diversity of research approaches to fully address any question.
And Bruce, you've had 2, I guess, parallel, very successful, satisfying careers of both practice ownership and publishing over 270 papers. If you had to choose one of those routes, if we said you can't have both, which would it have been, do you think?
Honestly, we would have real trouble choosing. to me, one without the other is only, half the picture. I guess if I had to choose, I would probably go for the research side, because intellectually it is challenging. But then again, every time I'm in practice, I'm still in practice typically 1 day a week. And most days I will see a patient that causes me to really scratch my head and really puzzle over what's going on in this patient. And so I'd have been happy with either, frankly. But I think if I had to choose, it would probably be the research path.
When it comes to the running the business, did you enjoy the stuff that people often grumble about with practice ownership? So having to think about staff and all of the issues that inevitably come with the human game.
Yeah, at times it was enjoyable. At times it was hassle, to be honest. But it's nice trying to build a practice. And I took a very different approach to the practice. So at the time that I bought the practice, everyone was going more commercial, and they were doing special offers and advertising, and the practice that I bought was in a sort of slightly sleepy arcade in a town centre. And I decided to move it out into a house practice. And several people, one of the shop fitters that came round basically told me that I was an idiot. He said, everyone is moving out of houses into the high street. You're doing the opposite. You think you're clever. I think you're mad. Was very much his approach. And I was just convinced that there would still be a demand for a practice with a clinical emphasis. And obviously you need to sell glasses, and selling glasses is an important part of it. It's no use coming up with the best prescription in the world. If a patient doesn't get glasses that fit well and that suit them, they're not going to wear them. So you've got to have that as well. But I wanted a practice that was driven by clinical care. And there's a lot of patients that walk into a practice that's very commercial and that think this is not for me. I'm worried about my eyes. I want somewhere where I'm going to be reassured that they're worried about my eyes as well. So I think there's a place for a plethora of different approaches, and we had a more clinical approach. And we weren't in Harley Street, we were in Essex, but there are enough patients around the practice that value that sort of approach to make it successful, and that's all you need.
In 2022, you sold your remaining shares in your practice, and in 2023, you stood down from the Institute of Optometry, but you don't seem to have actually retired. So what are you up to now, and why that career change?
Yeah, after 25 years of running a practice, which I found enjoyable, but towards the end, it did get a little bit repetitive, that this sort of annual things would come round, like staff appraisals and accounts and things like this, and price changes. And I'd seen 25 of these annual events coming round. And I thought it was time really for new challenges. And at the same time, having run the professional doctorate at the Institute of Optometry for 15 years, that involved researching ideas that students brought with them, that optometrists that wanted to do research as a prof doc would bring an idea with them. And I was keen to get back to researching the topics that I personally found most interesting. And at the same time, over the years, I've been doing an increasing amount of expert witness work that I found incredibly rewarding and enjoyable. And that had got to the stage really where I needed to give that more time. And trying to split my time between all of these activities was not working as well. So I'd worked alongside Anita Shah and Claire O'Leary at my practice for a number of years, who were brilliant clinicians who were interested in buying into the practice. So over 3 years, they bought me out of the practice, and I retired from the Institute as Director of Research and set up a new company called Evans Optometric Consultancy. And that's set up with 3 other members of my family, all of whom are involved in the eye care professions and bring different skill sets to the company. So we do mainly research consultancy, and I was surprised how many companies are interested in having someone research a topic, might be literature for them. So we do that, we do expert witness work, and we do lecturing and teaching. And that company's really taken off and has taken up more time than I anticipated, but in a good way. And alongside that, I still work in practice 1 day a week, now working for Anita Shah and Claire O'Leary, which is brilliant actually to see the way they're developing the practice. And I also do some, I guess you'd call it pro bono research. So research that I'm not funded to do, but that lets me research the topics that matter most to me. And that's really meant some new challenges, some new directions to go in, and has made my life, I think, much more interesting at this stage.
Well, should we hear what some of these topics are? What are you most interested in right now? What's hot?
Myopia control is a big passion. It's the big question for eye care. I mean, at the same time, it's the big need, I think, in optometry is to slow down myopia progression, but it's also a big development for the optometric profession. We've always been correctors, if you like. So a patient comes in and we help them to see better, and that's a wonderful privilege to be able to do that. But that's all we do. We don't fix the underlying problem. And that's why I've always liked orthoptics, because occasionally when you do some orthoptic treatment, it might be patching, it might be fusional reserve exercises, occasionally you really do see a significant improvement in someone's visual status. You really treated them rather than just correcting them. And the beauty of myopia control is that we can do that now. We can actually take a patient who was destined to be a -6, and we can make them perhaps a -4 at the end of the day. Now that will increase the probability of that person having good eyesight for the rest of their life. And that's really important to do that. And I got interested in myopia control 25 years ago because of my myopic patients progressing and me thinking really there must be something we can do other than just watching it get worse at every visit that they come to. So that's exciting now. There are some really good myopia control interventions out there, but there's a real need to know how they compare with one another. There's lots of studies comparing a myopia control intervention with a placebo control. Very few that compare two myopia control interventions with each other. So Lewis Marshall, Chris Hull, Miriam Conway and Dave Edgar and I are working at City University of London researching this at the moment, and that's a great study to be involved in. Really excited about that. Also with a team at Anglia Ruskin University, we're getting back to researching dyslexia and vision. So another topic that's always interested me, and there's many unanswered questions in that area. So we're researching that as well. And yeah, really enjoyable and nicely complements the other activities that I'm doing as well.
In terms of the myopia stuff, Bruce, do you have a hunch as to where we might head in the future with that? Do you think it lies in pharmaceuticals or optical interventions or a combination therapy approach? Or is it too early to say, do you think? All
of the above, I think. And what's really interesting, the other thing I've become very interested in research in recent years is moving away from describing measures of central tendency. So what I mean by that, your measures of central tendency are things like the mean and the median. And researchers always talk about this. And actually, over the years, I've got more and more interested in individual data points. When you look at the research on myopia control interventions, and it doesn't matter if it's atropine or myopia control spectacles or myopia control contact lenses or orthokeratology, in all of the studies of these, you get a mean treatment effect, and that treatment effect might be slowing myopia progression by on average 40-50%, which is great. But when you look at the individual data, there will be some participants in that trial for whom it's been a cure, for whom their myopia has stopped progressing absolutely. Now, some of those it might have stopped anyway, but there's always more in the experimental group where the myopia has stopped progressing completely than in the control group with these modern interventions. But there'll also be some participants for whom it's been a complete failure, for whom their myopia has progressed just as quickly after the intervention. And what we don't understand is how we can predict which group people are going to fall into. We can look back and say this is what happened, but we can't look forward and say it's going to work for patient A but not for patient B. So I think we need a lot more work to try and understand in the multifactorial mechanisms of myopia why there are some factors that are probably relevant for some patients more than for other patients. But what this does mean is that combination approaches are going to be, I think, the way ahead, where the first line of intervention doesn't work. So we'll try something like a myopia control spectacle lens, and if that doesn't work, then we'll add in something else. And that might be a blurring technology, or it might be atropine when that becomes available in the UK. And I think We really need so much more research to know which combinations work best and when we need to start engaging with those combinations.
And I noticed you used the word when and not if with the atropine. Do you think that's inevitable? Is it coming? What's stopping it? Why haven't we got it? Other countries have.
I don't know the politics of why we don't have it yet. What I've heard is that the higher percentages were incredibly effective but caused lots of side effects, the typical side effects, but not just blurred vision and large pupils, but also complications like blepharitis in some cases. So there was then a lot of interest in lower doses. 0.01% became very fashionable, but nowadays there's growing evidence that 0.01% is probably not effective enough. So it's a trade-off between minimal side effects and getting a decent dose effect. And I think part of the difficulty is that there really hasn't been a settling yet upon what percentage is the one to go for. What's the sweet spot, if you like? Is it 0.02%, 0.05%? And that's difficult from a manufacturer's point of view, because clearly if they're going to invest in setting up huge plant and manufacturing facilities, they need to know what percentage to go for. So I think that's part of the uncertainty. There's a number of randomized controlled trials on Western populations of different percentages. The picture's still being coloured in, if you like, and we need that colouring to know exactly where to go. But there's a lot of IP optometrists. If I was a young optometrist now, I would go and do the IP because A, it's a good thing to do for the individual, for the profession and for their patients. But B, we are going to see, I'm sure, more pharmacological interventions for myopia. So I think there's going to be a real need for those IP optometrists in community practice.
And do you think that will be restricted to IPs and it won't be a general exemption?
Yeah, I don't know, and I'm not party to the discussions on that, but I think it's very likely that it will be restricted to IPs, at the very least in the early days.
And as someone who in practice tries to put cyclopentolate in children on a reasonably regular basis, and I know how difficult it is to get the second drop in, my worry about atropine is, well, if this is stingy eye drops, are the kids going to get used to it, or are we going to get a couple of drops in the first week and just never again?
Yeah, I mean, evidence from Asia, China and other countries where they use atropine a great deal is they do manage and they do get it in effectively. So I think it's possible, but yeah, that's going to be another challenge.
So Bruce, you've been involved in expert witness work for a long time. So what fascinates you about that area of your work?
I think like all of us, really, I think we all have an innate sense of justice, of wanting to see fairness work in practice. And I really enjoy these expert witness cases from a point of view of trying to be fair to both parties. So there are some cases I've taken on where, frankly, a clinical error was made. It might be an error that somebody shouldn't have made. It may be an error that, frankly, under the circumstances like COVID, was understandable at that point in time. But an error was nonetheless made, and a patient's lost sight because of it. And in that case, we have insurance, and the patient, quite frankly, should get compensation because that's the best that we can do to redress an unfairness that's happened. Other cases, though, that I've had, frankly, there may be an accusation against an optometrist that is, in my view, unfounded, and the optometrist did a job that was completely reasonable and that many of us would have done. And in that case, I have that burning sense of justice that the optometrist actually should not be punished when they've done nothing different to what their fellow colleagues would have done. And sometimes in these cases, there will usually be two expert witnesses. And although an expert witness is appointed by each side, the law is very clear that the expert witness owes their allegiance to the court or the disciplinary panel. They don't owe their allegiance to the side that appoints them. And in fact, it's an adequate defence if there's a body of reasonably competent optometrists that would have done the same as the optometrist that's been accused. And some experts kind of use expert witness work as a way of settling the score if other people don't do things the same way as they do it. And that really makes me feel that that's the wrong way to go about it. We should accept the fact that there's a range of different opinions within the profession, and there's a range of different ways that people practice. And as long as there's a body that have done the same as that optometrist and they're reasonable, then what they've done is acceptable, even if it's not what I would have done. So the cases I do are typically either GOC disciplinary cases or more commonly civil litigation. civil litigation, when an optometrist is being sued, hardly ever gets to court. They're always settled. And then really what you're trying to do is assist in reaching an equitable outcome that's fair to all parties that are involved. And with these, I mean, sometimes you spend hundreds of hours on a case going through all of the medical records, all of the optometric records, really thinking about, not with hindsight, but at the time that the practitioner saw the patient, what was reasonable for them to have done. And I find this hugely interesting, but also hugely rewarding, because usually, nearly every case actually, there is a fair outcome at the end of it. And being part of that process, a small part, but nonetheless a part of that process, is, I think, a really worthwhile thing to do.
Do you have any tips for optometrists in practice for whom this always hangs like a sword of Damocles, doesn't it, over everybody, every patient they see?
Yeah, I've got a new lecture that I put together on this, and as part of this lecture on how not to get sued, is basically the bottom line of the lecture. Part of that was looking at research that's been done on, for example, GOC cases. And you find actually the demographic that is most at risk of having a clinico-legal complaint against them is older male practitioners. So I'm in that demographic. You're okay, Kerry. But it's, yeah, sorry, you're getting there. And I think it's often doing things year after year, you get a little bit more abbreviated in your record keeping each year. You get a little bit more abbreviated in your explanations. And we probably, particularly men, I hate to be sexist, but if it's against my own sex, I guess I can do it. We tend to get a little bit overconfident in, I'm pretty sure it's not that. And, whereas we might have done a few more tests to investigate whether it's glaucoma, for example, in previous years, we might abbreviate things a bit more over the years. So record keeping is important. The evidence we have from research I've done on record keeping with Raki Shah and Dave Edgar a few years ago is that optometrists tend to record a bit less when they're more experienced. And often an optometrist will record what they think is useful for the next practitioner, which is completely sensible and completely reasonable. But if there's a complaint against you, then it means your records may not be adequate. So a newly qualified optometrist would, of course, do things the way they were taught to at university. And over the years, we all get a bit less thorough in our record keeping. The obvious things are the repetitive patterns that one sees in disciplinary cases. So things like low tension glaucoma, low pressure glaucoma, normal pressure glaucoma, and patients with flashes and floaters, where the patient may underplay the recency of their symptoms. And, if a patient walks in and says, I've got a new huge floater that just came in today, we'd all dilate them. But if they say, I've had new floaters for a week or two, would we all? I think for safe clinical practice, we should be dilating, where there's any question mark of a change in flashes and floaters. So a lot of the cases, really the usual suspects, frankly.
I think one of the helpful things is I was in a practice where it was myself and a gentleman that was just a little bit older than me, and we were sort of growing old and into those record keeping mistakes together, I think. And now I'm in a practice where we've got quite a wide range of levels of experience. So I've been in practice the longest, but we've also got people who are only qualified a year or two ago, and I feel like they keep me fresh, and I learn things from my colleagues about record keeping. That's really quite important. It's like you said, diversity is really helpful.
And Bruce, maybe a nice place to wrap things up is thinking about the future of optometry, whether or not that step that you took where you went against the grain a little bit and moved out of a retail setting, if you like, to a house practice and really showcasing your clinical skills. Do you think that's where the future of optometry lies, particularly in the context of IP and all of those opportunities? Or do you think we're still going to be reliant upon that retail side of the business going forwards?
I think there's growing diversity within the optometric profession. There's growing specialism, but also I think there's a diversity in practice styles and modes of practice. And I wouldn't for a second argue that a practice with a more clinical emphasis is in any way further up a hierarchy than a more commercial practice. I think each do a slightly different emphasis of the work in a very, very good way, and that both are necessary. And there'll be some patients that will be attracted more to a more commercial practice, some to a more clinical. And as a profession, we need to reflect what our patients want. And because there's a diversity of patients, there should be a diversity of practice types as well.
And perhaps just before we sign off, outside of all of this amazing stuff that you've done within the profession, you still seem to find time for sailing. What does that bring to the party for you? Is that just a way of relaxing, or are you researching on the boat?
Yeah, I've always had a passion for water sports, and pretty much every water sport you can imagine I've done at some time. These days, windsurfing, which was my passion for many years, is a bit more challenging because bits of you break much more easily at my age. So I do more sailing on boats now, and I've got a boat in the West Country. And the nice thing about the sort of slightly restructured working life that I have is anywhere that I can open a laptop, I can work. And so I work mostly from the boat in the summer and mostly from home in the winter. And I probably work about 50 hours a week in winter and about 20 hours a week in summer. So I can kind of balance my working hours depending on the time of year. And typically I'll sail somewhere, sail to a new anchorage or a new harbour for a few hours a day, and then do work for a few hours a day. And various members of the family will come and join me at various times. So yeah, it's working out really well and completely enjoyable. I just need more of the year to be summer.
Yeah, it sounds perfect. Bruce, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. It's been really fascinating hearing about your career path, and I'm sure some of this will be inspiring to optometrists throughout the UK.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Don't forget to visit the OT website, a source for all of your optics-related news, in-depth features and opinion. It's updated 7 days a week. Our education library is bursting with over 600 past CPD exams, as well as video skills guides and webinars which will support your learning on a range of clinical topics and techniques. Why not watch our recently released new 3-part video skills guide exploring the management of dry eye? Visit www.optometry.co.uk. Don't forget to visit the OT website, a source for all your optics related news, in-depth features and opinion. It's updated 7 days a week. Our education library is bursting with over 600 past CPD exams, as well as video skills guides and webinars which will support your learning on a range of clinical topics and techniques. Why not watch our recently released new 3-part video skills guide exploring the management of dry eye? Visit www.optometry.co.uk.